Little Women. A Letter from Father. It was 2 days before Christmas. Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy March were sisters. Meg was 16 and she was very beautiful. She had big eyes and beautiful long brown hair. Jo was 15. She was tall and thin. She had dark eyes and long brown hair. Beth was 13. She was very quiet. Little Amy had blue eyes and yellow hair. It was 6 in the evening and the girls were at home. They talked about Christmas. Jo wasn't happy. "It's Christmas, and we aren't going to have any presents," she said. Meg looked at her old dress. "I know, Jo," she said, "but we don't have much money." Amy said, "My friends are going to have presents. I want some presents too." Beth smiled. "We don't have any money," she said, "but we have Mother and Father, and we're happy." Jo didn't smile. She said, "We don't have Father. He's away in the war, and he isn't coming back for Christmas." Maybe he isn't going to come back, the girls thought, but they didn't say it. "We have a little money," Meg said. "What can we buy?" "I want a new book," Jo said. She loved reading. "And I'd like some pens," Amy said. "I don't want any presents," Beth said. "Let's buy presents for Mother. We can put them on the table for her on Christmas Day." "Yes," said Jo. "Let's do that. We can buy them tomorrow. What can we get for her?" Then Mrs. March arrived in her dark coat and old hat. She called, "Children, I'm home." "Hello, Mother," the girls answered. "Come and kiss me, girls," Mrs. March said. They went to her, and she smiled at them. "I have a letter from Father," she said. "Let's eat, and then we can read it." Later in the evening, Mrs. March said, "Sit down now, girls. I'm going to read Father's letter to you." It was a happy letter. Father didn't talk about the war. The letter finished, "Give my love and a kiss to my little women. A year is a long time, but I think of them every day." The girls were very unhappy. They wanted their father. They thought about his letter. "I'm going to be good this year," Amy said. "I don't like my work," Meg said, "but I'm going to do it well." "I want to be a little woman for Father," Jo said. "I'm often angry, but I'm going to stop now." Beth didn't talk. She looked at the floor. "Don't be unhappy, girls," Mrs. March said. "Let's play a game." After the game, Beth played the old piano. Then Mrs. March said, "Good night, girls. Sleep well." She kissed her daughters, and the 4 girls went up to bed. Christmas Day. On Christmas morning, Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy opened their eyes and looked under their beds. There were 4 books there. Meg's book was green, Jo's was red, Beth's was white, and Amy's was blue. "Oh, Mother," they thought, "you are good to us." Meg opened her book and started to read it. Her sisters listened. Later, they went down to the kitchen. Hannah was there. She lived in the house, and she helped Mrs. March. There was food on the table. "Where's Mother?" Meg asked. "I don't know," Hannah answered. "She went out very early." Amy looked out the window. "She's coming down the street," she said. "Quickly," Jo said. "Put her presents away." Mrs. March came into the house. "Good morning, Mother," the girls called. "Where were you?" Jo asked. Mrs. March answered, "I went to Mrs. Hummel's house. She has 7 small children. They don't have any food and they're very cold." She looked at her daughters. Then she said, "It's Christmas, girls. Can we give them our food?" The girls looked at the food. They wanted to eat, but they said quickly, "Oh, yes, Mother. Can we take it?" They went to the Hummels with a big bag of food. Later in the morning, the girls said, "Here are your presents, Mother." "Oh, thank you. You're good children," Mrs. March said. She looked at her presents and smiled. In the evening, the girls' friends came, and the girls acted for them. They loved acting, and their friends had a good time. Then Hannah said, "Come and eat, children." On the table there was a lot of food and some fruit and candy. The girls looked at it with open eyes. "Where did it come from?" "It's from Santa Claus," Beth said. "No, Mother did it," Meg said. Joe said, "It's from Aunt March. Maybe she likes us on Christmas Day. She doesn't usually like us." "You're wrong," Mrs. March said. "It's from old Mr. Lawrence. You see him sometimes. He lives near here." "Yes, but we don't know him," Meg said. "He was a friend of my father," Mrs. March said. "He knows about the food for the Hummels. This food is for you from him because you didn't eat well this morning." Joe's friend said, "My mother knows old Mr. Lawrence. He's a good man, but he doesn't see many people. His daughter's dead and her son lives with him. The boy's name's Laurie." "I want to meet Laurie," Joe said. "We don't know many boys. Maybe he can act." "He can visit us," Mrs. March said. Joe smiled. "Oh," Beth said to her mother, "we're very happy. But Father isn't happy." "No," Mrs. March said quietly. She kissed her daughter. "I want to see him," Beth said. "I want to give him a present." "I know, Beth, I know." The party 5 days later. Meg came quickly into the house. "Joe, Joe," she called. "Where are you?" "Here," Joe called. "I'm reading." Meg had a letter in her hand. "Listen, this letter, from Mrs. Gardner. It's for you and me, and it says, 'Please come to a small party tomorrow evening. I talked to Mother, and we can go.'" "Oh," said Joe, "a New Year's party." "Yes," Meg said, "but we don't have the right dresses." Joe said, "And I have a burn on my good dress." "You can sit on a chair all evening," Meg said. "Then people can't see the burn. Don't dance." Before the party, Beth and Amy helped Meg and Joe with their dresses and their hair. "I can curl your hair with some hot curlers, Meg," Joe said to her sister. Suddenly Beth said, "Oh, look, Meg's hair, it's burning." "Oh, oh, oh," Meg said. My hair, I can't go to the party now." But Amy said, "Put a ribbon in your hair." "There, you can't see the burn now." Beth kissed Meg and said, "You're beautiful." "Do you have your gloves, girls?" Mrs. March asked. "Good. Have a good time, and come home at 11. At the party, the music played and Meg danced. A tall boy with red hair walked across the room to Joe. "Can we dance?" he asked her. Joe wanted to dance, but she thought about the burn on her dress. She smiled and said, "No." Then she went quickly into a small, quiet room, but the Lawrence boy was there. "Oh, I am sorry," Joe said. "I didn't see you." She looked at him. "You live in the big house near our house. My name's Josephine March, but people call me Joe." The boy smiled. "Hello, I'm Laurie," he said. "Laurie Lawrence?" Joe asked. "My name's Theodore," he said, "but I don't like it because boys called me Dora. Now I'm Laurie." "We loved your Christmas present," Joe said. "Do you like parties?" Sometimes. I was in France for years, and I don't know people here. France, Joe said. Can you talk French? Joe and Laurie talked and talked. Laurie liked music. Listen to the piano, Joe said. Let's go and dance. Yes, let's do that, Laurie said. Oh, Joe said suddenly. I can't. Why? Laurie asked. I have a burn in the back of my dress. I can't dance. Laurie smiled. People aren't going to look, he said. Please come. The party finished, and Joe and Meg went home. They went up to their bedroom. Amy and Beth were in bed, but they quickly opened their eyes. Amy said, Did you have a good time? Oh, yes, Meg said. And you, Joe? Beth asked. Yes, I had a good time too, Joe said. Here's some candy from the party. They talked for a long time about the party and about Laurie, the Lawrences. One cold morning, Meg and Joe didn't want to get up. I don't want to work today, Meg said. I want to stay at home too, Joe said. But we can't do that. Meg was the teacher for 4 children in the King family. The job was difficult because the children only wanted to play. Joe worked at Aunt March's house. Aunt March was Father's sister, but she had a lot of money. Joe liked her house because she had a lot of books. But Aunt March was an angry woman, and Joe didn't always like her. Amy went to school every day. Beth was a very quiet girl, and she didn't want to go to school. She helped Hannah in the house, and she had a teacher at home. In the afternoon, Joe came home from Aunt March's house. She looked up at the Lawrences' big house. Laurie was at a window. Joe called, Hello, how are you? Are you sick? Laurie answered, No, I was sick, but now I'm well again. Come and talk to me. Joe went into Laurie's house and they talked. Joe thought, Laurie doesn't see many people, only old Mr. Lawrence and his teacher, Mr. Brooke. What are you thinking, Miss Joe? Laurie said. She answered, Come and visit us. You can meet Mother and my sisters. Beth can play the piano and Amy can dance for you. Meg and I can talk to you. Laurie smiled. I'd like that, he said. There was a noise at the door. Then Laurie said, Excuse me, the doctor's here. Can you wait? Yes, of course, Joe said. In the room there was a picture of Mr. Lawrence. Joe looked at it and said, His face isn't very friendly, but I like him. Thank you, said a man behind her. It was old Mr. Lawrence. Joe's face was very red, but the old man smiled. How do you do? He said. Come and sit with me. Laurie came back, and Joe talked about her family with him and Mr. Lawrence. After this visit, the March girls often played at Laurie's house, and he came to their home. Beth often played the piano there. It was a good piano, and Mr. Lawrence liked listening to her music. I had a little girl with your eyes, he said to her one day. She played the piano too. She was Laurie's mother. Then one day there was a piano in the March family's front yard. The letter on it said, To Miss Elizabeth March. For me, Beth said. Yes, it's a present for you from Mr. Lawrence, Joe said. Quiet little Beth went quickly to the big house. Thank you, she said to the old man. Then she kissed him. After that, the Marches and the Lawrences were very good friends. Problems for Amy. I want some money, Amy said one day. It's important. Why, Amy? Meg asked. Every day my friends take candy to school. I eat their candy, but I can't buy it for them. Here's a little money for you, Meg said. But please don't ask again. We don't have a lot of money, you know. "Oh, thank you, Meg," Amy said. In the morning, at school, Amy had the candy in her bag. Now every girl wanted to be Amy's friend. Katie Brown said, "Please come to my party." Then Jenny Snow said, "Can I have some candy? I can help you with your schoolwork." "No, you can't have any candy," Amy said. "Yesterday you said, 'Amy March is fat.'" She walked away. Jenny Snow was angry, and she went to the teacher. "Mr. Davis," she said, "Amy March has some candy in her school bag." Mr. Davis was angry too. He didn't like candy at school. "Amy March," he said, "come here, bring me your candy." Amy walked to Mr. Davis's table at the front of the room. He said, "Never bring candy to school again. Do you hear me?" "Yes, Mr. Davis," Amy said. Then he said, "Your hand, Miss March." Amy closed her eyes, and Mr. Davis hit her hand. "Now stand here at my table," he said. "Don't move." Amy's face was red, and she was very unhappy. Later, the teacher said, "You can sit down now, Miss March." But Amy didn't sit down. She didn't talk to Mr. Davis or the girls. She was angry and unhappy. She went home. "Amy, what's wrong?" Mrs. March asked. "Why are you home from school early?" Amy said, "Mr. Davis hit me because I had candy at school." Mrs. March was angry now. "Mr. Davis hit you," she said. "That's not right, and PM going to write a letter to the school. You can stay at home. Beth's teacher can teach you too." "Good," Amy said. "But Amy," Mrs. March said, "you were bad. Mr. Davis doesn't like candy at school, and you know that." Amy thought about that. Then she said, "Yes, I wasn't very good. I wanted to be important, and that was wrong. PM, sorry." Amy's mother and her sisters looked at her and smiled. Amy is angry again. "Meg, Joe, where are you going?" Amy asked one Saturday afternoon. "You can't come, Amy," Joe said. "I know," Amy said. "You're going to the theater with Lori. I'm coming too. I have a little money." "It isn't for little girls," Joe said. "And Lori asked us." Amy was very angry. "You're going to be sorry, Joe March," she said. Then Lori arrived, and Meg and Joe went to the theater with him. In the morning, Joe asked, "Where's my book?" Joe liked writing stories, and she was a good writer. There was many years' work in that book. Meg and Beth said, "We don't know." Amy was quiet. "Do you have it, Amy?" Joe asked. "No, I don't," Amy said. "Amy," Joe said, "where is it?" "I burned it," Amy answered. "You burned my book," said Joe. "My stories were in it. You bad girl." She hit Amy and walked away. Later, Joe came down again. "I'm very, very sorry, Joe," Amy said. But Joe didn't look at her. In the evening, Mrs. March talked to Joe. "Amy did a very bad thing," she said. She kissed her daughter. "But please be friends with her. Don't be angry now." "I don't like her, and I don't want to be friends," Joe answered, and she went to bed. The morning after that, Joe thought, "I want to be happy today. I'm going to go ice skating with Lori." She and Lori walked down the road with their skates. Amy watched them. She wanted to go too. Meg said to her, "Go after them. Kiss Joe and say sorry again." Amy walked to the river behind Joe and Lori. Then Joe and Lori started to skate, and Amy skated too. Joe didn't look at her, and Lori didn't see her. Then Amy moved away from them. The ice was thin there, and suddenly, crack, She went down into the cold water. "Help! Help me!" Amy called. Joe looked now. "Oh, no, Amy," she said. "We are coming, Amy." Joe and Lori quickly helped Amy out of the water. She was very cold. Her face and hands were blue. They went home quickly, and Hannah went to Amy's bedroom with her. Later, Joe was in Amy's room with her mother. They talked quietly. "Is Amy going to get well?" Joe asked. "Yes," Mrs. March said. "You came home very quickly. You helped her." Joe said, "I was very angry with Amy, but now I'm sorry." "I'm often angry. What can I do?" She looked at her sister. She was beautiful with her yellow hair. Amy opened her eyes and looked at Joe. They kissed, and they were friends again. "Joe," said Mother, "you are very angry sometimes. You can stop that. Please try. But you're a good girl, and I love you." Joe kissed her mother. Meg's glove. In the summer, Lori said to the March girls, "Let's put a letterbox in the tree in front of your house. Then I can send you letters." The girls liked the box. Beth opened it every day. One day she said, "There's a letter for Miss Amy." "Thank you," Amy said. "There are 2 letters for Miss Joe and a very old hat." "I burn my face every day in this sun," Joe said. "Lori's a good boy. And there's a present for Miss Meg March." "It's a letter, and my glove," Meg said. "But there's only one glove. I had 2 gloves at the Lawrence's house yesterday." "There was only one glove in the box," Beth said. "Were you with Mr. Brooke yesterday?" "Yes," Meg said. "He wanted to read a story to me." Mrs. March looked quickly at her daughter. Meg was very beautiful, but she was a child. Her mother smiled. That summer was a happy time, but winter came. In October, the days were cold and short. Joe was in the house one day. She looked at the little book in front of her. "There," she said. "I can take it now." She went quietly out of the window. Her mother and sisters didn't see her. Joe went to an office in town. Lori was in town too, and he waited for her. She came out into the street, and her face was red. "What's wrong?" Lori asked. "I went to the newspaper office with 2 stories," Joe said. "The man said, 'Come again in a week.' He's going to read them." "That's very good," Lori said. "Josephine March, the famous American writer. But Joe, I want to talk to you about Meg's glove. I know about it." "Where is the glove?" Joe asked. "It's in Mr. Brooks' coat," Lori said. "Oh no," Joe thought. "Mr. Brooke loves Meg. He's going to take her away from us." 2 weeks later, Joe came into the house with a newspaper. "Are there any good stories in the newspaper?" Meg asked. "Yes," Joe answered. "There's one good story." "Please read it to us," Amy said. The 3 sisters listened. "It's good. Who's the writer?" Beth asked. "Your sister," Joe smiled. "You," Meg said. "Yes, me." "It's very good," Amy said. "Oh, Joe," Hannah said. Mother smiled and kissed her daughter. "Father's going to be very happy." Joe's hair. The letter arrived in early November. Lori was at the March house with the girls and their mother. The letter said, "Mrs. March, Mr. March is in Washington, and he is very sick. Please come quickly. From S. Hale." The girls were very unhappy. Mrs. March's face was white. "Children, listen to me," she said. "Help me, please. Lori, please write to Mr. Hale. I'm going to take the morning train." "Yes, Mrs. March," Lori said. "Joe, take a letter to Aunt March. I'm going to ask her for money. Beth, ask Mr. Lawrence for food and drink for Mr. March. Amy, get my black bag. Meg, come and help me." Later, Mr. Brooke came to the house. He said to Meg, "Miss March, I want to go with your mother tomorrow. I can do some work for Mr. Lawrence in Washington, too." "Thank you," Meg said. "Mother would like that." Mrs. March came in. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Brooke," she said. Then she asked, "Where's Joe?" The front door opened. It was Joe. "Joe, your hair," Mrs. March said. Joe's hair was very short. "What did you do?" "Aunt March is reading your letter," she said. "But here's some money for Father from me. I went to a man in town. He buys hair." "Oh, Joe, thank you," Mrs. March said. "I love you for this." Joe smiled at her mother, but that night she didn't sleep. "What's wrong, Joe?" Meg asked. "My hair," Joe said. Her eyes were red. "My hair." "Beth is sick." The girls said goodbye to their mother. Every day they did their work, but they thought about her. One day, Beth said to Joe and Meg, "Please go and see the Hummels." "I can't go. Can you go, Joe?" Meg asked. "No, I have a cold," Joe answered. "Can you go, Beth?" Meg asked. "I go every day because Mother isn't here. But one child is very sick and I can't help her. Please go." "I can go tomorrow," Meg said. Beth went to the Hummels' house. Later she came home. She was very unhappy. "What's wrong, Beth?" Joe asked. "Oh, Joe, the child's dead. I stayed with her and Mrs. Hummel went to the doctor's house. He came, but the child was dead. It was scarlet fever, and now I'm sick too." "Oh no," Joe said. "I'm going to get Hannah." Hannah looked at Beth and called doctor. "Bangs." "Amy," Joe said, "you're going to Aunt March's house." "No," Amy said. "Yes," Hannah said. "Do you want scarlet fever?" Later in the week, Beth was very sick. Joe stayed with her. She washed her sister's face and talked to her. But Beth didn't know Joe, Meg, or Hannah. Joe wanted her mother, but her father was sick too. They didn't write to Mrs. March about Beth. Dr. Bangs came every day. One day he looked at Beth and said, "Please write to Mrs. March now." Then Laurie came to the house. "Your mother knows about Beth," he said. "Your father isn't very sick now, and she's coming home this evening. I didn't wait." "Oh, Laurie," Joe said. "Thank you." In Beth's bedroom, Meg and Joe looked at Beth's face. It was white. Joe thought, "Oh no, my sister's dead." She kissed her and said, "Goodbye, Beth, goodbye." But Hannah looked at the child and smiled. "Beth isn't dead," she said. "She's sleeping. She's going to be well again." There was a noise at the door. "Listen, girls," Hannah said. Laurie called, "She's here. Mrs. March is home." "What is love?" Mrs. March came into the room. Meg and Joe kissed her. Then Beth slowly opened her eyes and smiled. Mrs. March stayed with her all night. In the morning, Joe went into Beth's room. "Mother, I want to talk to you," she said. "Mr. Brooke loves Meg. Did you know that? I don't like it." "I know," Mrs. March said. "John Brooke talked to your father and me in Washington. Does Meg love him too?" "I don't know," Joe said. "I don't know about love. I liked Mr. Brooke's letters about Father, and I like his eyes. But I want Meg here, at home with us." "John's a very good man," said Mrs. March. "He helped Father. But don't think about it now. Christmas is coming." On Christmas Day, Beth was in bed, but Amy was home again. It was a good day. There were beautiful presents from Laurie and Mr. Lawrence. Then Laurie arrived. "And here's a big Christmas present for the March family," he said. He opened the door again, and there was Mr. March. The girls went to their father and kissed him. They were very, very happy. "Quietly, girls," Mrs. March said. "Beth is sleeping." But Beth came down from her bedroom. "Oh, Father, it's you," she said. In the morning, Mr. Brooke talked to Meg. "I love you," he said. "Do you love me?" "I'm only 17, Meg said. "I don't know." Then Aunt March came into the room. Mr. Brooke went out quickly. "Where are your mother and father?" Aunt March said. "And what's that man saying to you?" "He's Father's friend, Aunt March," Meg said. "Then why is your face red?" Aunt March said. "You can't marry him. He doesn't have any money. I'm not going to give you my money." Meg was very angry. "I don't want your money, Aunt March. John loves me, and he is a good man. We can work for our money. I am going to marry him." "Marry him, then. I don't want to see you again." Aunt March walked out of the house. Meg didn't move. She looked out the window at her aunt's back. Mr. Brooke came into the room again. "My love." I listened. Thank you," he said. "Can I ask you again?" Meg looked into his eyes. "Oh, John, the answer's yes. I'm going to marry you, and we're going to be very happy." Later, Joe talked to Laurie. "I love Meg, and I want her with me," she said. "But she's going to be happy, and that's good. And I'm happy today. Mother and Father are here. Beth is well again. Meg loves John. Amy and I are friends, and you and I are friends too. I'm writing, and people like my stories. But Laurie, are we going to be happy in a year? Or in 2 years? Who knows?